Thank you all for joining for our Deeper Inquiry number 14. It's been a few years now that we've been trying to bring ideas, content, and things that we think are on the forefront or about to be on the forefront of the philanthropy world and social movements. Um, Impact is a golden oldie that we've wanted to work with for a while now. And it's also been part of a lot of internal discussion for many, many years. And we think that not just in Guerrilla, but within the ecosystem at large, it is one of the most talked about points that also influences and affects how we think, what we choose to measure, what we choose to look at. And I wanted to start by sharing a little definition from data feminism that I came across earlier. Um, it's it's called Big Dick Data. Big data projects that are characterized by patriarchal cis-masculinist totalizing fantasies of world domination as enacted through data capture and analysis. These projects ignore context, fetishize size, and inflate their technical and scientific capabilities. Now, really, just to poke the finger in totalizing fantasies, so like absolutism, domination, like I am here to really influence, it's like top-down energy and mentality, ignoring context, so like misunderstanding interdependence, and doing away with what we often have as a useful heuristic, which is historical analysis and a multidimensional approach to seeing the world. So I'm really excited to go through some of these and way more topics with Toby Lowe. Um, and we know what we're up against in terms of the conditioning and in terms of what the ecosystem is so embedded in and driven by. But we're also looking at what the alternatives are and what we need to do to make the shift. Toby, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Right, let's get slideshow share. Great. Can everyone see my slides up on screen? Someone? Yeah, perfect. Excellent. So thanks for spending a bit of time with us this afternoon, folks. My name is Toby Lowe. I am a professor of public management at Manchester Metropolitan University here in the UK, and I'm also a director of a small social consultancy company called Civinet Associates. And I work with public service and philanthropy organisations around the world to help them find ways of organising, governing, and funding change work that enables it to work in complex environments. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about escaping the trap of impact measurement. So what I'm going to cover is I'm going to talk a bit about the impossibility of the idea of demonstrating your impact in a complex system. And I'm going to describe what an alternative looks like for that in terms of using impact measurement in the work and in terms of funding for continuous collaborative experimentation and learning. So where does the trap of impact measurement come from? I think it comes from a really understandable impulse that many people have in this sentiment that we want to know the difference that we're making with our work. And I think that this impulse is felt acutely by funders because funders are acting at a distance from the work. Therefore, they don't get first-hand experience of the effects of the work that they're supporting. And this is the same problem that is felt by all people who are abstracted from the work of social change, but who are supposed to be in charge of it in some respect. So how can we respond to that impulse, that desire that we want to be able to demonstrate the impact of our work? Well, I think the response that we can make initially is to highlight that there are two foundational problems with the idea of demonstrating your impact. So I'll take you through both of those problems now, because this is the reality that we have to face when thinking about their impulse. So the first reality is that in a complex system, it is impossible to measure your impact as distinct from all of the other factors that make up that complex system. Let's explore what we mean by that. So here's a systems map of the outcome of obesity. So it shows that there are 108 different factors which contribute to the outcome of obesity or its absence, and it shows the relationships between all of those factors. So this work was done by the UK Government Office for Science in 2007. It's essentially what happens if you shut a bunch of public health people in a room together and say you're not allowed out until you create a systems map for the outcome of obesity. So we can see from this work that the outcome of obesity is created by all of these factors operating interdependently, and they can be summed up into things like people's early life experiences, food production and supply, macroeconomic drivers, education, technology, the nature of work, the built environment, and healthcare and treatment options. And so let's explore, using this systems map, let's explore what it means to try and understand your impact if you're working to tackle obesity. So let's say that you're one of the people providing, operating in the bottom right-hand corner of that system. You're looking at healthcare and treatment options. That's the work that you do. So let's say that you're delivering weight loss programs in neighborhoods. How would you distinguish the impact of your weight loss program from the influence of all the other actors, all the other factors in this system? The short answer is you can't. So someone on your weight loss program sees a film that changes their perspective on the meals they cook. Someone on your program changes jobs to a place with a canteen where they only serve healthy options. Someone else is made redundant so that they can't afford to buy healthy food. In all of those situations, what's the impact of your program in that on the impact on obesity? It is impossible for you to identify your impact as distinct from all of those other things going on. And the reason that it's impossible is that complex systems change continuously in unpredictable, emergent ways. So in a complex system, you cannot produce a reliable counterfactual. So, and without a reliable counterfactual, you cannot say, this is my contribution to the change in this system, because you cannot say, without my intervention, this would not have happened. So there are various things you can measure and various helpful methods like outcome harvesting or ripple effects mapping. Or there are good ways to measure. You just can't say with any certainty that any of the things you measure are caused by your work. And this creates this is about really the rigor of working in complexity versus pretending that the work is simple and attributable in the way that we've been used to. And essentially, for the last 20 years, we've been pretending that it is possible to measure your impact, because that pretending makes us feel better. Because that pretending makes the task of funding or managing easier. Because because we feel uncertain in the face of complexity, and we desire to create process which reduces those feelings of uncertainty. But we really need to be adults and to face the truth of working in complexity. We need to do like that little person who's opening the door to the messy reality of the world. We need to recognize the hard truth that we haven't been measuring our impact. We've been measuring all of the noise and the messiness of a complex system. We've been measuring what's measurable and calling that our impact. So we've been pretending, and it's time to stop. Because when we pretend in this way, we create a bunch of nonsense work for those who are actually trying to do the work of social change. So let's dive into just one example of the kind of nonsense that gets created in the name of this, trying to understand our impact. Let's look at some of the ridiculous levels of pretending that happens. So an example I want to share with you, the case of the Sportworks program in the UK. So this was a program which funded physical activity in order to create social impact. It was the part of the UK government's legacy program for the 2012 Olympics. So This Sportworks program funded thousands of small-scale activities around the UK, and they wanted to know the impact of those. So what they did, they said, okay, we need to create a tool to measure impact, which is light touch enough so that it can be used by volunteers running sports clubs. So people who haven't got a lot of time to do like detailed measurement and data analysis. But they said this tool must also be, as you can see from this quote, robust enough to produce, quote, management information of sufficient quality to enable investment decisions to be made with confidence. So this is a quote from the Sportworks full report from the academics who produced this work. So what they did was they employed the best team of researchers in the country on the impact of physical activity to create this impact tool. And those researchers spent hundreds of thousands of pounds creating a theory of change which would stand up to academic scrutiny and which would produce this kind of reliable impact data so that funders could make these good investment decisions. And these are the results this impact tool produces. So if you feed your project's impact data into the tool that they developed, into their robustly researched theory of change, it creates this kind of impact information. So these are real results created by a sport project undertaken by a friend of mine. So this is the impact generated by an after-school table tennis club, according to this tool. So by providing once a week after-school table tennis facilities for these kids, this project achieved a nearly 50% reduction in these children's likelihood to commit crime, saving nearly £500,000 in public service costs. They identified a 30% reduction in obesity, saving over £1 million in social costs. So with impact data like this, how could a funder resist? Remember, this is, and we quote, management information of sufficient quality to enable investment decisions to be made with confidence. Here's the data that actually produced, that underpinned those results you just shown. So this is what the person running the table tennis club was obliged to collect was this one-page worksheet for each young person that attended the club. So this one-page worksheet has 6 multiple choice questions, agree, disagree, or don't know, in respect of questions like, has this project helped you stay out of trouble? Has this project helped you get fit and healthier? Obviously, says the person, I'm playing table tennis. This is the degree of pretending that happens when the dream of impact measurement meets the reality of complexity. So in order to make the process of data capture light enough to enable it to be usable by people actually doing the work, we have to then pretend that this kind of data can reliably create the impact results you saw on the previous page. Remember, also, increasing the level of data capture doesn't make any of this process any more reliable, because in a complex system, it's simply impossible to say what the impact of 2 hours of table tennis on a Wednesday evening has for kids, because you cannot produce a reliable counterfactual. But that doesn't make it wrong for these kids to be playing table tennis. It's just wrong to try and make an assessment of whether that's useful work by this kind of impact measurement. So that's the first problem, that in a complex system, it is literally impossible to measure your impact as distinguished from anything else. Second problem is that if you seek to use impact as a tool for performance management, then what it does is it corrupts the data that you otherwise would be quite useful for you. So in this context, performance management specifically includes deciding whether organizations receive funding or not based on the impact data they produce. So what happens if you try and use impact data as a criteria for your funding? And what happens is Campbell's law kicks in. So Campbell's law was created by an American social scientist in a very famous essay published in 1979 called Assessing the Impact of Planned Social Change. You can see why that might be quite important. And this was from the second ever issue of the academic journal Evaluation and Program Planning. So in it, he creates this law. he says, the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. So if you put decision-making stress on the metrics that you use, so like if you say we will only fund this if it produces good-looking impact data, then what happens is that the process of creating that impact data gets corrupted, because people will game the system in order to make sure that their work produces good-looking impact data. How do we know? How do we know that this is the truth? Because Campbell's law has been tested. So this was a systematic review of the effects of target-based performance management systems published in 2018. So they looked at all of the data on the effects of all of the research studies on the effects of using targets to make these kinds of decisions over the previous 40 years across private, public, and voluntary sectors. And what that systematic review found is that over 80% of those studies find evidence of gaming. So by that I mean the deliberate manipulation of data to make it look good. And 3/4 of those studies find evidence of people deliberately lying. So this is the kind of mic drop research findings from this space. If you use a target-based performance management system, then you cannot trust the data in your system to be reliable and accurate. Simple as that. So let's have an illustration of this from this world. This was a big lottery fund, which was a kind of large-scale UK grant maker. They have a fund called the Reaching Communities Programme, and it is their largest scale grant making programme. And in its first 10 years, it was an outcomes focused grant making programme. So if you wanted money, you had to promise to deliver particular outcomes impact from your work. And so after 10 years of this programme, they commissioned an evaluation. And they found that in the first 10 years of grant making, they'd given over £1 billion worth of grants over that 10 years. And in those £1 billion of grants they'd given to thousands of organisations, turns out they hadn't given a single unsuccessful grant. Not one. Every single one of those grants that they'd made, the organisations hit the outcome targets that they identified. Every single one of them hit created the impact that they said they were going to do when they were planning it. What do we think the chances of that are in reality? Not large. Not large. This cannot be true. But this is exactly the corruption of data that happens when you put this kind of decision-making criteria associated with measuring impact. So when you ask organisations, if you're a funder and you ask organisations to demonstrate your impact, what happens? The evidence says this is what happens. What you get is mass pretending and the corruption of data. So that's the problem. What's the alternative look like? So in order to answer this question, we can ask, this feels like an appropriate question to ask. How is impact created in complex systems? Because when we understand how impact is created in complex systems, we can fund and organise and manage so as to support the processes by which impact is created in complex systems. And we know now quite a lot about how impact is created in complex systems. It is created through continuous collaborative experimentation and learning. It is impact is created by those doing the work continuously asking the question, what works for you in your context, and experimenting around that. So let me give you an example of what that looks like in the public-facing work from the world of kind of osteopathy. My partner works in the field of chronic pain, and so this is the process that she uses when she's working with someone in chronic pain. So the first part of the learning cycle here, so we can frame people's work as learning cycles to enable them to turn these complex systems that they're faced with into learning systems. The first part of that is to work with the person who in front of them for the person who is in chronic pain to say, okay, our first job here is to understand your life as a system that's creating the outcome of chronic pain for you currently. So I might ask you, if I'm working with you in that way, I might ask you questions like, what was going on for you in your life when you first started to experience the pain? And on days when the pain is unmanageable for you, what's going on in your life at those points? And by having those kind of conversations together, we can build up a picture of your life as a complex system that is creating the outcome of chronic pain. So we develop that shared knowledge and trust between us that we have a good enough understanding of your life as a system that's creating this outcome. And from that, we can begin to co-design experiments and explorations in your life to see whether we can get your life as a complex system to produce a different pattern of results, not chronic pain. So we can say things like, what happens if we try this pain medication? What happens if we try this physiotherapy technique? What happens if we try if you join this walking group? What happens if you try these exercises? What happens if we try fitting this enablement equipment to your house? And the crucial thing is the what happens if we frame all of that as experimentation, as exploration, as action research. So we're taking this work of social change, moving it out of a delivery mindset and into the idea that every single act of public service or social change is an act of shared, co-created action research with the people that are being served. And so we can do all this. We can frame all of these questions. What happens if we try? And we can ask questions, okay, what data do we need to collect for us to understand what happens if we try this physiotherapy technique? What happens if we try this pain medication for you? What happens if we try this enablement equipment? And then we can run all of those as experiments and explorations, and we can learn uniquely what works for you in your context, right here and right now for you, because it'll be different for the person next door to you. And it might even be different than you 6 months ago or you 2 years in the future. We need to learn what works for you in your context right now. And the only way we can do that is through this process of collaborative experimentation by asking, what's the impact of us trying this on a micro scale? And so those impact measures are unique to each person and context. So what is being measured is exactly what matters to the person being served, or to the people being served, or to the community being served. So the impact measures aren't for reporting to others. The impact measures are for those doing the work, the citizen and the person serving them. And so what we're doing here is changing the purpose of measurement. So the purpose of impact measurement is for learning and improvement, not for performance management. That's the really crucial change that we can make to enable impact measurement to work. So this is part of a reframing of the work of creating impact. Impact isn't delivered by people or organizations. So as soon as we accept the reality of complexity, this is obvious, right? Impact isn't delivered. Instead, impact is co-created as action research between those doing the work and the people that they serve. So creating impact in someone's life is an act of shared exploration. So impact measurement is about collecting the data which helps those doing the work and those they serve to make sense of what's happening in their lives. Because only they have enough contextual understanding to interpret that data effectively and to say what action needs to arise from. So you have a choice as a funder. You can choose to use impact measures to decide who to fund. And if you do that, the likelihood is that you'll get a bunch of good-looking corrupted data. Remember the big lottery fund. Or you can use impact measures for learning and improvement. You can support those who do the work to use impact measures in respect of seeing their work as continuous action learning, not as the delivery of programs. So as a funder, if you can't use impact measures to decide who to fund, or if you're a manager, who to employ, then how can you choose who to fund or who to employ? And the answer that we've learned is you choose to fund those who will learn well in collaboration in respect of an agreed purpose. So you can ask of people or organizations, do you share the purpose that we're trying to achieve here? And you can undertake, you can build a relationship with them that enables you to ask the question, can you undertake collaborative action learning rigorously and systematically? Because those are the things, those are the criteria you can use to decide who to fund, and by following those criteria, you will be supporting the processes that create impact in the world. Here's an example of what that looks like in practice. So this is what funding for continuous collaborative experimentation and learning can look like. It's funding to enable the kind of learning cycle that I shared before. So this is from the Swedish International Development Agency. They contracted an organization called Climate Kit to create the Systems Innovation and Experimentation Fund, which they built around the kind of learning cycle that I showed you earlier. So what happened was that the grant application process tested the work that applicants had done to understand the systems that they wanted to change. So they had applicants wanting to change how energy production worked in Colombia, and how female employment happened in Kenya, and so in each of those, they tested questions like, do you understand who the actors in that system are that you've identified? What happened when you brought those, what knowledge was created when you brought those actors together to reflect on the system factors that you've identified? So essentially, the grant application process tested that work that the applicants had done, and they supported those, and then they gave resources to those who were able to demonstrate that they could bring actors together to understand their context and experiment collaboratively. And by using that as their criteria for funding, they were then able to give development grants to support actors in those systems to develop action research activity and to explore the actions that they wanted to undertake to create change. And then they funded those as pieces of action research. So they weren't funding the delivery of programs, they were funding organizations to experiment and learn collaboratively in their context, because that's how impact is made. So, summarize all of this. Well, if you're a funder and you're asking the question, what can I do to help create impact in the world? Firstly, stop asking teams or organizations or programs to demonstrate that impact, because it actively gets in the way of the learning processes required to make impact work. At the very best, you're wasting people's time. At worst, you're corrupting the data required to learn. And it's your responsibility if you're a funder, because you're asking the wrong question. Secondly, fund so as to enable continuous collaborative experimentation and learning. Make that the explicit nature of the resource bargain. And essentially what you're trying to do here is find those you can trust to share your purpose and fund like you trust them. So that's the really top level kind of framing all of this. If you would like help with that kind of stuff, there's what I've shared with you today is in the Insight series of reports on the Human Learning Systems website. If you want to begin to experiment with how to do this stuff, there's a practical guide that you can download that enables you to think about how to frame work as learning cycles at any different system scale that you might be operating on. There's a new funders action learning group that the Centre for Public Impact are creating if you want to explore how to work in this way alongside a set of other funders who are interested in trying to create the same way of working. Then get in touch and I can connect you with the folks at CPI who are doing that. If your organization needs help from a learning partner to explore how to work in this way, again, get in touch, emails there. Hope this has been interesting in some kind of way to you. Now we get the opportunity to really have some dialogue together. Thanks very much. Kind of like make the screen share. Stop. Yes, there we go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Toby. Yep, there's a round going on. It's just digital. I I really love that you do feel listening that this is actually a systems thinking conversation, much more than into the depths of impact measurement, because it doesn't take it as at face value. It actually asks some questions before you get started, which are completely shifting the intention and then what we're drawing our attention to in what we measure, how we learn, and why we're doing it. And I know that there will probably be also now some discussion into nitty gritty, but the beginning, the conditioning, the lens with which we approach the reasons why, our motivations. This is also why we played Kraftwerk's numbers in the beginning, to just set the vibe of following numbers in order to control, dominate, or be in a position of power, rather than from a genuine place of learning and understanding and collaborating and growing together in this process. So thank you very much. And also, folks, will have another round, another deeper inquiry on impact coming up. So you'll be able to follow that if you follow us on Eventbrite or YouTube or any other social platform.